Hi, I'm Scott Allen Miller. This is Sam IT on YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about why generally systems administrators don't compile software. So this is one of those things that comes up, and mostly it came up in the late 90s, early 2000s in the Linux space. It became a really common thing for people to talk about and assume that you were going to do a lot of compiling software as a systems administrator. And this is a weird kind of Linuxism. I don't know what the exact source of it is. Obviously in the very earliest days of Linux, you were stuck in a situation of having to get source code and compile everything yourself. It's just how it worked. We didn't have distros to put all these things together for us, so it was a little bit complicated and we had to do it. That was like the early 1990s. That was a long time ago. And any operating system before it goes into production is going to be stuck in those kinds of scenarios with weird things. Somehow it became culturally aligned with Linux to at least feel you had to compile or feel you had to know how to compile, and you probably should, and that you would do it all the time. A lot of exams started questioning around compiling software instead of managing software in normal ways. And this exacerbated the problem, and it became a cultural thing where people would talk about how they do it all the time. And to some degree, it's because people who work in this space kind of take pride in that they can do this really complicated software installation method. And on the other side, on say like the Windows side, it became kind of a mark of shame to mock how much work the Linux world had to do the simplest tasks, and how you had to have all this knowledge and skill and special tools or semi-special tools just to do the simplest things, when on Windows you could just, click an installer and have the software install. Of course, this hasn't been true in Linux in decades, like a quarter of a century, more maybe. Right? We're talking about a very long time, I guess not more, but about a quarter of a century this hasn't been true. Not only does Linux have all the installation methods that Windows has, but it has some really amazing ones that Windows doesn't. In fact, if you're doing normal software installs on Linux, you are getting an amount of power and an amount of ease of use that Windows doesn't come close to. And so it's odd that even now, nearly a quarter of a century after this has been a thing, and it's never really been a thing in production, that people still have this feeling that you're going to either need to compile software or that you should, that it's somehow a good thing. And so let's talk about that. That you don't have to, that's easy. Basically, it should never come up. And in fact, in most production environments, installing a compiler is considered a no-no, right? Why is there a compiler on your production box? Your production boxes should not be compiling software. That's not what production's for, right? It's fundamentally a misunderstanding of how to run a production system. So why is this? Why do we not want to be compiling software on our own? And the first thing I have to say is, I said generally at the beginning, there's always a case where someone's going to need to compile software, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? We're not saying that compiling software is wrong. We're saying that it's not a normal and not a generally accepted production process. And this goes back to a lot of things, but it's mimicked in other operating systems, right? You would never think of just going out and compiling your software for Solaris. You wouldn't just think of going out and compiling your software for Windows. You wouldn't think about going out and compiling your software for AIX. Why does Linux, and to some degree BSD, get this feeling that we should do it here and not there? Of course, part of this is the open source culture. In those other worlds, there's not open source, so compiling isn't an option. So you could say, well, everyone would compile if they could. Okay. But that's not the case, right? There's a ton of open source software on Windows. No one goes out and gets a compiler and does that stuff. And there are free compilers for Windows. There are cheap compilers for Windows. And they're not doing those things because it makes no sense. Now, let's go back to other things that we generally look at for production. So when we're choosing a Linux distro, for example, traditionally we've leaned very heavily towards large, managed, long-term support distros like Red Hat. Many, many years in between new versions. Support goes on for decades. This is a managed system where Red Hat engineers have looked at every component in the system, made sure that they work together, tested them against each other, made sure that their versions work with each other, etc. Right? There's a lot of work that goes into making all the components work together. to make sure that they really, really work as intended, Red Hat compiles all those things into nice installer binaries like RPM files and provides them for their ecosystem in very simple deployment ways. So it's very fast and effective to deploy the versions that Red Hat has defined, has tested specifically, and is managing the patches. The entire production ecosystem of any production operating system depends on these kinds of things. Now, of course, you may not depend on your vendor all the time, right? In this case, I'm mentioning Red Hat, but it may be that you're in a Fortune 100 and you have a large engineering team, and they're providing basically their own internal distro, or they're managing applications on their own. That's great, and they can do those things, and they're just acting as the distro creator at that point, so don't feel that that somehow breaks the system. That's still them providing the same type of oversight. It's just that they're making their own distro internally. So all of this gives you an amount of control to know exactly what a package should look like. It allows you to put a hash against it, whether that's an MD5 or whatever, to know that you're getting exactly the package you're supposed to get. It allows you to know that all the testing has been done against that. If you're compiling on your own, you're left with either having to compile in lots of really complex ways to generate a hash, and by the time you're doing that, there's no reason to have compiled because you've already verified that you're recreating the same binary. You're just coming up with a really slow, cumbersome way to recreate that binary. So that doesn't make any sense. If you were going to do that, you would simply create the binary once, somewhere else, and provide it to all the systems that need to have it. And when you're doing this custom compiling process, it means that you are unable to leverage all of that testing that other companies have done with those versions to ensure that they all work. So it basically defeats the purpose of having a well-maintained enterprise distribution in the first place. Now, of course, there's always that one piece of software that may be the anomaly, and oh, it's my custom software and I have to have it compiled, it's how it works. That's fine. But when we start getting into the randomly compiling all kinds of different components of the operating system wherever we want, suddenly we start breaking things that we got the distribution in the first place to provide. Things like dependence between packages and automatic patching that companies like Red Hat or Ubuntu, Canonical, SUSE, the things that they put in so much effort to provide for you are being broken. You're just giving those things up. And in a production environment, you don't want those. You either need them from your vendor or you need an engineering team that's doing that job instead of a vendor. Either way, compiling your own software on your systems breaks that and makes for a very complex management process. And so that's why we don't compile, right? It breaks the things that make your operating system powerful. It's an archaic way of working. Once in a while it's required, but it is cumbersome and it is unnecessary. It is good to know how to do it. I am not recommending that we turn out systems administrators who don't know how to compile software, but let's be honest, compiling software is a developer's job, not your system administrator's job. We're being a little bit weird to push it to systems administrators, and it's unique to just one or two operating systems that get the feeling that it's acceptable to do this or that it's appropriate to do it on a regular basis. So I really, this is something that I think is very important. It's really, for the most part, a hobby process that is interesting, and you'll see people and say, well, I want to learn systems administration. And a lot of people will say, oh, go out and get something like Gentoo Linux and compile the whole thing on your own because you'll learn so much by compiling it. That's probably not true because you're going to learn a lot about compiling, which is not something you do for production systems administration. And it really highlights how much things like Gentoo are a hobby system. It's fun, it's interesting, it lets you tweak things that otherwise you don't get to tweak. But it's not appropriate for a production environment. You don't want your databases running on systems that were custom compiled and now have to be maintained every day by people checking out the compilation. And then how do you test? It becomes a very expensive, complicated testing mechanism, and it'll never approach what Red Hat's able to do for themselves, for example. Today it has become very much just something carried forward from the hobby world, and there's a lot of that in systems administration, especially in the Linux space. So it's important to watch out for that. Sometimes those hobby processes creep in, and sometimes they creep in with a kind of sense of superiority or cool or respectability because they're hard or weird. And then it's easy for people to get drawn in and think that that's what they should be doing and that they're being lazy by doing it some other way, and that's not the case. Custom compilation is simply not a good production process without an extreme niche case that justifies it. So if you have a technical need that makes it make sense, by all means, don't stop doing it. Don't feel that you're doing something wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say. But if you're compiling just because you think compiling is fun or that it's how you're supposed to be doing it, stop. It is not fun. It is a waste of time. It is not how you're supposed to be doing it, and it creates a lot of problems that are assumed to be fixed in the modern world that should be. Unless you have that need, don't do it. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe, and remember you can support us on Patreon.